Hi, this is Craig Stocks here at Utah Desert Remote Observatories. You can find us online at utahdesertremote.com. And I get asked occasionally about my stars. So today I'm going to walk through an example of how I process stars in PixInsight and Photoshop. I'm going to start in Photoshop, and most recently it was this image of the Rosette Nebula that prompted some questions. But looking at the initial raw data, the stars were really in pretty good shape to start with, so I'm not sure it's the best example. So I'm going to choose one that's a little bit more difficult. So, and also it had a very little data and only 2 red frames, and one of them had this satellite or airplane streak in it, which made it a little bit more convoluted to process. So I think instead what we'll do is we'll look at the Pacman Nebula. So here's the red, green, and blue, and I'll just throw a quick screen stretch on the red, and you can see it in the And you can see right away the stars are not as tight here, so it needs a little bit more attention. So the first thing I'm going to do with my RGB data is combine it into a single RGB file, and I'll do that with the channel combination tool. And we'll just put the red into the red channel, green into the green channel, and then blue into the blue channel. And notice these are 120-second subs, and that's typical if I'm shooting a narrow band target and I really just want RGB primarily for the stars, and that's really what this data is focused on. We'll go ahead and process the RGB, but I'm really focused on just the stars. So let me go ahead and park these out of the way, and let's take a quick look at the RGB with the screen stretch. And as you would expect, it has a color cast. I mean, they almost always do. But it does have a lot of color and a fair amount of detail in the nebula. I have been experimenting lately with the Grexpert, and I will work from saved process icons over here on the right. I have another video that shows how to create these, but these are a quick way to kind of speed up your process. So you can just grab the saved process icon and drag it onto the image to execute that process. And one nice thing about Grexpert versus using dynamic background extraction is you can run it on multiple images at once. You don't have to actually go through and do any initialization. It's all automagic, as they say. And it has done a nice job with this data. And we'll update the screen stretch. Yeah, that looks like that's looking good. So I want to do color calibration, but I want to tighten up the stars a little bit first. And one of the recommendations was to run Blur Exterminator in correct only mode, where all it's doing is correcting the star shapes. So I will do that again with the saved process icon, where the process was saved with those settings. And this usually takes about 30 seconds, so I'm just going to pause the video while we wait for it to run. Blur Exterminator has now done its thing, and I don't notice a big difference in the stars. If I just do a quick undo, that was before, and this is after. So now we can run spectrophotometric color calibration. And again, I have saved process icons for the various systems. This was captured with the Dream astrograph. So we'll pull this over. This is it's not a real common scope. It's a 16-inch fast Newtonian, so 16-inch mirror, f3.75, and it has a 1500 millimeter focal length, and it has an ASI 6200 mm Pro monochrome camera with a filter wheel that currently has LRGB, H, and O filters. It doesn't currently have a sulfur filter, but I plan to add that sometime in the not too distant future. But this is going to do its thing and give us color calibrated red, green, and blue stars. And it looks like it's just finishing up. And it is done. So again, update the screen transfer function. And this is where we are now. So now we've got proper color in the stars, which also gives us pretty good color in the background. The next thing I want to do is run Blur Exterminator again. And because the stars are so prominent here and I want to minimize them, I'm going to use a version or a saved setting of Blur Exterminator with more aggressive star reduction. So if we just take a look at that real quick, what I've done is just increase sharpen stars from its default, I think, of 0.2 up to 0.35. Not super aggressive, but it's going to tighten up the stars even more as it also sharpens or applies deconvolution to the background. So we'll apply this. And again, this will take about 30 or 45 seconds to run, so I'll pause the video while we wait for it. Blur Exterminator is now finished, and we'll just update the screen transfer function again just to get a current view of where we're at. Not much change at this point. Now I'm ready to stretch the image, and I know different people have different approaches and different sequences. This has worked well for me, so I process the image fully through Blur Exterminator and SPCC, and then I stretch the image, and I do it real simply. I just use the screen transfer function because I'm going to finalize the stretching in Photoshop anyway. So I'm just trying to get something that is a good stretch that uses as much of the range of dark to light as I can without any clipping of either the blacks or the whites. And it doesn't have to be perfect, so I don't spend a lot of time sweating it. If you have trouble adjusting the sliders the way I just did, just use the screen transfer function as a default. You don't really have to make a lot of changes here. So we've now stretched it, and of course it also has the screen stretch applied, so we'll turn off the screen stretch. There's our stretched image. The last two steps are Noise Exterminator and then Star Exterminator. And as I've mentioned before, I use a process container that contains both Noise Exterminator and Star Exterminator with the Star Exterminator settings to save the stars. So we'll just apply that. Again, this will take about a minute or so to run, so I'll pause the video while we wait. Star Exterminator is finished now, so we have our stars only image as well as the nebula only image. And the last thing I will do here, even though these stars look nicely saturated, what I find is when I add them over top of a more saturated background, and especially if you are doing an SHO version, you tend to wind up with a more colorful background than what these were extracted from. The stars tend to lose their saturation. So the last thing I'm going to do is a little process container that I just have labeled as Enhanced Stars. And it does two things. It applies a curves transformation, and that curves transformation is really just applying a increased saturation curve. And then the second thing it does is apply an SCNR, where it's removing green by around 0.73 to knock out any green that may have gotten exaggerated by that curves. And so typically what I do is, because this is a saved process container, again, I can just drag it onto the image and it will run both of those steps for me, one after the other. And now we have the finished stars. And they look oversaturated. They probably won't look oversaturated when we put them over a colorful background. If they do, we can always back off the saturation in Photoshop. So now I need to save these two files as 16-bit TIFFs. So I'll just simply go to File, Save As, and I'll navigate to the folder where I want to save the TIFFs, and I typically go back to the original folder where the data was collected and save it as a TIFF. You need to be sure to specify TIFF and then 16-bit. So that's the stars, and then we'll do the same thing with the nebula. And we'll save that again as a 16-bit TIFF. Okay, now we are ready for Photoshop. So let's hop into Photoshop. And you've probably seen me do this before, but we'll go to File, Scripts, Load Files into Stack. And what this is going to do is let us load these two files as layers. And it'll use the file name as the layer name, so it's easy to keep track of what's where. And of course everything is aligned, and even if we had done multiple images, if they were all processed together through WBPP, everything would align. So we just go to my Astro folder, Dreamscope data, the Pacman nebula, and I generally keep my folders sorted in descending date sequence, so the top two here are the most current ones. And that adds them to the list of files we want to open. And then click OK, and that'll now go through and actually open those two files. And as soon as we get this in Photoshop, we'll do a little bit of housekeeping, and then we'll start on the processing. So the housekeeping I like to do is I like each layer that I bring in to be in its own group. And then that lets me better organize the adjustment layers that are going to affect that layer. It also lets me somewhat isolate the effect of the adjustment layers, especially with the stars. So we'll put the stars layer on top, and I want to put it into a group, and the easiest way is Control-G. As a keyboard shortcut, that would be Command-G on a Mac. And we'll just label this stars. And I know I'm going to do two things with this. I know I'm going to apply a levels adjustment. So I'll just go ahead and add that into the group. And typically what I'm going to do with that is use it to darken the stars. And you notice as I darken this stars only layer, the stars get much less dominant. So you can make stars bigger or smaller just by changing the brightness or that midtone slider. I will also almost always add a hue saturation adjustment layer. I don't know that I need to add much, but if we want to, we could add a little global saturation here. The other thing that I think tends to happen is the red stars get too saturated. So I'm going to target just the reds in this hue saturation adjustment layer and then reduce the red saturation. And sometimes I'll reduce it a lot. And that gives me, I think, a more balanced looking set of stars. And then the last thing we'll do is we'll put this in screen blending mode. And almost like magic, now we have what looks like could be an almost finished image. We'll quickly pop down to the RGB layer. Again, Control-G to put it into a layer. Add a levels adjustment layer. And I'm going to darken the background a little bit and brighten the highlights a little bit. And I think I would like to sharpen this a little bit more. So I want to sharpen just this layer, and I want to do it non-destructively. So I'm going to convert this just by right-clicking to the right of the layer name, convert to Smart Object, and that will convert this layer into a Smart Object, and then I can apply a non-destructive filter, and the one I typically use is Smart Sharpen. And you can just adjust your sliders to what looks good, and of course, because it's non-destructive, you can always come back and change those settings anytime in the future, even after you save the file, as long as you don't flatten things. So that is with some Smart Sharpen. Another technique I like to use, and this is deviating a little bit from the stars, so just think of this as a bonus tip. If you've done much Photoshop processing of astro images, you've probably heard or used high-pass sharpening. And high-pass sharpening can be used with fine settings to sharpen detail. It can be also used with fairly large settings in order to create more local contrast. And I'm going to do that using a smart object. Normally you'll see people recommend duplicate the layer and then apply the filter. Again, I like things to be non-destructive, so I'm going to apply filter others, high-pass filter, to this smart object. And the settings at this point don't really matter much. With practice, you'll get to know, kind of what you're looking for. Click OK, and it really looks terrible. And that's because what we need to do is change the blending mode for just this high-pass filter. And to do that, we'll right-click on this little icon on the right-hand side of the layer. And when we double-click on that, that will bring up a blending options for this smart filter, and for this smart filter only. So it's just the high-pass filter. And what we're going to do now is change its mode to soft light. And so now we are applying this high-pass filter in soft light blending mode. And if we decide we want to adjust the settings, just like any smart filter, you can double-click on that filter and it will bring up that smart filter's settings, and then we can adjust, do we want it a larger radius or a smaller radius? And it's just a matter of playing with the different settings and finding what looks good to you, keeping in mind that it's never cast in bronze. You can always come back and change it later. So that overall is, I think, looking pretty good. Let's pay attention to our stars now. So let's go back to the stars layer. As I mentioned, we can use this slider to darken the stars if we want to make them less prominent. Something else we can do is experiment with a different blending mode. This is screen blending mode, and this is technically the blending mode if you use the unscreen stars option in Star Exterminator. Then you would put the stars back in using screen blending mode. And that's a fairly aggressive method of adding the stars. If we want a less aggressive method, we can change this to the lighten blending mode. And you don't see a lot of difference, but it lets me make the stars much more subtle, especially where they're against a dark background. And just to compare, this is in lighten blending mode, and notice I'm changing the blending mode of the layer group, not the layer itself. This is lighten, so that's screen and lighten. And lighten does a really nice job in general. If we want to take these small stars out even more, we're going to do about 3 more things here. First, I'm going to convert the stars into a smart object. And if you did astro processing kind of back in the dark ages before there were tools like Star Exterminator, you may have used the dust and scratches filter to remove stars. And that's what we're going to use here, but we're using it on a smart object. So go to Filter, Noise, Dust and Scratches, and the larger the radius, the more stars it will take out. And usually I find somewhere in the 3 to 7 or 8 range is kind of the happy place. And what that's doing, and the preview is usually not very accurate, so you have to apply it and see if you like it. And we'll just say that's okay. And let's take the... So now we've made a big change in the stars. In fact, that's probably too much. So let's go back to dust and scratches, and we'll take it down to, let's try 5. But we want to take out the little tiny stars that just look like noise, but not the smallest stars. And we still want some variation. The other thing you'll notice, because we're using, let's add a sharpen layer. So again, filter, sharpen, Smart Sharpen, and this will let us sharpen the stars. They don't usually want a lot of sharpening. Now, there are two drawbacks to using the lighten blending mode. The first one, if you look in the kind of the bright part of the nebula, where these stars are against a bright background, the lighten blending mode doesn't really bring the stars out. And that's the advantage of the screen blending mode, is screen will always add, even if it's a bright background, where lighten will only add the stars if it's against a darker background. The other is our bright stars start to look a little bit choked and wonky. So I'm going to make a copy of this entire layer group. So I'll just Control J. That would be a Command J on a Mac. And this makes a second copy of our stars layer. And what we can do then is put some of the stars in screen blending mode and some in lighten blending mode to overcome the weaknesses. And it's because we have some smart filters applied, it's recalculating the smart filters on this copy. Of interest, perhaps, there's actually only one copy of the stars, and if we were to go back and change the source layer for stars, it would change both the original and the copy, because they're actually referencing the same smart object, but we can apply different filters and different settings in the adjustment layers. So let's put this top one now in screen blending mode. And I'm even going to bring some brightness back. So that's screen blending mode. But let's add this selectively with a mask. So I want to hide everything on this layer to start with and then just paint back in the ones I want. So I'm going to add a hide all layer mask, which you can do by layer, layer mask, hide all. So now we have hidden all of these. That looks like it added a vector mask. Let me undo that, because we want to add not a vector mask, but a layer mask. There we go. So there's a hide all layer mask, and we want to target the mask and make sure you see the double outline around the mask. Grab our brush tool from the toolbar over here, or by tapping B on the keyboard. I want white as my foreground color in 100% opacity. And I'll start with just a pretty big brush, and I'll paint these stars in screen blending mode in over the bright part of the nebula. And that brings those back. Now I'll go around with a smaller brush to some of these bright stars against the dark background, and I'm painting with white on a black mask, and what that does, white on a black mask reveals. So we're allowing these bright stars to show through. And this is a kind of a creative exercise. Bring out the ones that you want and don't bring out the ones that you don't want. But what I find is by having some brighter stars that really pop, it gives the whole image a little bit more sparkle. Now, we probably want to have the stars come from either screen or lighten and not both. So what I'm going to do is duplicate this mask onto the lighten stars layer group and then invert the mask. So to do that, I'll click on the mask, and on Windows I'll hold down the Alt key, that would be Option on a Mac, and drag down to the group level for the stars. And what that did is it copied the mask from the first layer group to the second layer group. Now with that mask targeted, I can invert it with a Control I. And now we have a mixture of screen stars and lighten stars, but not both. And then the last thing I would probably do here is come back and add a little bit more lightness to the lightened stars and maybe darken the screen stars just a little bit so that they look balanced. And visually that looks about right to me. So at this point we have an RGB image of the Pacman Nebula with RGB stars. And I think those look pretty good. If you have any questions, be sure to, the last thing you want to do when you save this, you want to be sure to save it as a PSB formatted file. So the last thing would be to go to File, Save As, and I'll save this in my 2024 folder, 2024 photos. And you want to choose large document format because this will be larger than 2 gigabytes, which is the limit for a standard document, PSD document. And we'll just call this save that. And at that point, we're done here and ready to open this in Lightroom to do any final tweaking for tone, color, contrast, crop, and then export it from there as a JPEG, which is what you'll see as the thumbnail for this video. So I hope you found this useful. If you have any questions, be sure to drop them in the comments below and I'll do my best to try to answer them. If you like content like this, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and that way you'll be sure to see new videos when they come along. And as always, I hope you have a great day today and an even better night tonight under a clear, dark sky. Thanks.